My name is David Richardson, and for 47 years I figured I had life pretty well sorted out. I wasn't what you'd call a dreamer or a deep thinker, just a regular guy trying to make an honest living in the insurance business here in Atlanta. Grew up Baptist like most folks in Georgia, but somewhere around college I started questioning all that Sunday school stuff. Made more sense to me that when you're dead, you're dead. No harps, no flames, just nothing. And honestly, that seemed fair enough. I wasn't the kind of man who caused trouble, paid my taxes on time, never cheated on my wife. Well, not physically anyway. Kept my lawn neat, said yes sir and no ma'am to my elders, and generally minded my own business. By most people's standards, I was doing just fine. Had a decent house in Marietta, a reliable Honda in the driveway, and enough money in the bank to sleep okay at night. Middle management at Southern States Insurance wasn't glamorous, but it kept food on the table and paid for my daughter's college tuition. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Success doesn't fill whatever empty space lives inside your chest. Late at night, when the house got quiet and Sarah was asleep beside me, I'd lie there staring at the ceiling fan and wonder what the hell any of it meant. All that work, all that responsibility, all those years of getting up at 6:30 a.m. sharp. For what? So I could retire at 65 and spend my golden years watching cable news and complaining about my back? Don't get me wrong, I loved my family. Sarah was a good woman, better than I deserved most days. And Katie, my daughter, she was the one bright spot in all of it. Smart as a whip, heading to law school, full of all that young idealism I'd lost somewhere along the way. When I looked at her, I could almost remember what it felt like to believe the world made sense, that good things happened to good people and everything worked out in the end. But deep down, in that place I never talked about, not even to myself really, there was this voice. Quiet but persistent, like water dripping in the walls. It would whisper things when I was driving to work or sitting in another pointless meeting. You're not a good man, David. You just pretend to be. And the worst part? I was starting to think it might be right. I went through the motions of caring, asked Sarah how her day went, helped Katie with her car payments, nodded sympathetically when my neighbors complained about their problems. But it all felt hollow, like I was reading lines from a script someone else had written. Sometimes I'd catch myself in the mirror and wonder who that tired-looking stranger was and how he'd ended up living my life. Science made sense to me because it didn't pretend to care about your feelings. Numbers don't lie, gravity doesn't play favorites, and death doesn't negotiate. I respected that honesty even if it meant accepting that consciousness was just brain chemistry, love was just evolved biology, and when your heart stopped beating, that was the end of the story. At least it was a clean ending. So there I was on November 12th, 2024, driving home from another forgettable business trip to Birmingham. Rain coming down like God himself was emptying buckets on Interstate 20, and me behind the wheel thinking about quarterly reports and mortgage payments and all the small, necessary lies that keep a life running smooth. That's when everything changed. The truth about my life came in pieces, like trying to reassemble a broken mirror. Each shard reflected something I'd rather not see, but couldn't look away from. My father had been dead 10 years by then, and I still heard his voice in every room I entered, measured, disappointed, strategically silent. He never raised his hand to me, never even raised his voice. He just waited. Waited for me to figure out what I'd done wrong this time. Waited for me to apologize for something I couldn't name. Perfect boys don't make their fathers worry, he'd say, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. And somehow, in that house on Peachtree Street, I learned that love was something you earned through performance. Straight A's got you a nod at the dinner table. Clean your room without being asked, maybe you'd get a good job, son. But mess up, forget to take out the trash, track mud on the carpet, laugh too loud during his evening news, and you got the silence. That terrible, suffocating silence that felt like the world ending. So I got good at being perfect, or at least good at appearing perfect. Made honor roll, played varsity tennis, never got arrested or brought home any girls mom wouldn't approve of. But here's what nobody tells you about perfectionism. It's a prison you build one brick at a time, and pretty soon you can't remember what you looked like before you locked yourself inside. That pattern followed me everywhere. College, my first job, my marriage to Mary. Always performing, always calculating what version of David Richardson would get the best response from whoever was in the room. At work, I was the reliable guy. The one who stayed late and never complained about unrealistic deadlines. With Mary's parents, I was the charming son-in-law who remembered birthdays and fixed leaky faucets without being asked. With my own daughter, I tried to be the dad I never had. Patient, encouraging, present. But Mary saw through all of it. She had this way of looking at me, especially toward the end, like she was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "You're never really here," she'd say, standing in the kitchen doorway while I pretended to read the newspaper. "Even when you're sitting right next to me, you're somewhere else." I'd tell her she was wrong, that work was stressful, that I was tired. All true enough. But the real reason I kept my distance had nothing to do with job pressure or fatigue. The real reason was terror. Pure, bone-deep terror that if she ever saw who I actually was underneath all the performance, she'd realize she'd married the wrong man. Because underneath it all, underneath the steady paycheck and the mowed lawn and the carefully managed reputation, I knew something Mary didn't. I knew I was fundamentally broken. I knew that whatever normal people had inside them, that thing that made them capable of genuine love, genuine connection, I'd never developed properly. I was like a house with beautiful wallpaper covering rotten beams. The drinking didn't help, though it felt like it did at the time. Started with a beer after work, then two, then a couple of scotches before dinner. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would get me in trouble at the office or make Mary stage an intervention. Just enough to quiet that voice in my head. The one that kept a running tab of all my failures and inadequacies. Just enough to make me feel normal for a few hours before bed. "You're disappearing," Mary told me one night, maybe 6 months before the accident. We'd just finished another silent dinner. Katie was at a friend's house, so it was just the two of us picking at leftover pot roast while the evening news droned in the background. "I can feel you pulling away from us, from everything." What's wrong? I could have told her then. Could have said, "I'm scared you'll figure out that I'm not the man you think you married. I'm scared I've wasted 20 years of your life. I'm scared that when I die, they'll lower me into the ground and realize there was never really anyone inside this body to begin with." Instead, I said, "Nothing's wrong. Just tired from the Birmingham trip." She nodded, but her eyes stayed worried. That was Mary. She could read people like open books, everybody except her own husband. Or maybe she could read me too and just chose not to because the truth was too sad to confront. The last conversation we had that meant anything was 3 days before November 12th. I'd gotten home late again, some bullshit meeting that could have been handled with a phone call, and found her loading the dishwasher in the dark kitchen. Katie was upstairs doing homework, music bleeding through her bedroom door. "David," Mary said without turning around, "do you love me?" The question hit me like cold water. Of course I loved her. I paid the mortgage. I remembered our anniversary. I'd never cheated on her or lied about money. Wasn't that love? But standing there in that dim kitchen, watching her shoulders move as she rinsed plates, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt anything like what the movies call love. I felt responsible for her. I felt protective of her. I felt guilty about disappointing her. But love? That warm, expansive feeling that was supposed to make life worth living? I couldn't even remember what that felt like anymore. "Yeah," I said finally. "Of course I do." She turned around then, and in the light from the hallway, I could see she'd been crying. Then why does it feel like I'm married to a ghost? I should have crossed the room and held her. Should have said something honest for once in my life. Instead, I poured myself a scotch and told her I was exhausted, that we could talk about it tomorrow. Always tomorrow with me. Always later, when I was less tired, less stressed, more ready to be the husband she deserved. The night of the accident, my last words to Mary were, "I'm beat tonight. Let's talk tomorrow, okay?" She was sitting on the bed in her reading glasses, some romance novel open on her lap. She looked up at me with those worried eyes and just nodded. I never got my tomorrow. The moment the truck's headlights consumed my windshield, something strange happened to time. It didn't speed up or slow down. It just stopped being relevant, like someone had unplugged the clock from the wall. The impact itself felt distant, muffled, as if it were happening to someone else in another room. I remember thinking, with odd clarity, well, this is going to hurt. But it didn't. Not really. What came next was the most peculiar sensation I'd ever experienced. It felt like stepping out of a heavy coat that I hadn't realized I'd been wearing. One moment I was pressed against the driver's seat, rain drumming against the roof, the taste of coffee and panic in my mouth. The next moment I was somewhere else. Still me, but lighter. Cleaner somehow. I found myself standing about 10 feet above the wreckage, looking down at the scene like I was watching a movie. My Honda was accordioned against the front of an 18-wheeler, steam rising from the radiator, hazard lights blinking orange against the rain-slicked asphalt. The truck driver was already out of his cab, talking rapidly into a cell phone, pacing back and forth with one hand pressed to his forehead. A few other cars had stopped, their headlights creating a circle of harsh white light around the accident. And there, slumped over the steering wheel, was what I gradually understood to be my body. David Richardson, 47, wearing the same blue tie I'd put on that morning in Birmingham. There was blood on my forehead, and his chest was moving with short, shallow breaths. Someone was trying to pry open the driver's side door with a crowbar from their trunk. The strange thing was, I felt no attachment to that figure behind the wheel. It was like looking at a photograph of myself from years ago, recognizable but somehow separate from who I was now. I felt a mild curiosity about whether he would survive, the way you might wonder about the outcome of a football game you'd stumbled across while channel surfing. What struck me most was the silence, not the absence of sound. I could hear the truck driver shouting coordinates to the dispatcher, hear the rain pattering against metal, hear the distant wail of approaching sirens. But underneath all that noise was a deeper quiet, a stillness that seemed to wrap around me like warm water. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, the constant chatter in my head had stopped. That voice that spent every waking hour calculating, worrying, measuring my performance against some invisible standard, it was gone. I tried to move closer to the accident scene and discovered I could drift wherever I focused my attention. Not flying exactly, more like being gently carried by currents I couldn't see. When I thought about the truck driver, I found myself beside him, watching his hands shake as he answered the paramedics' questions. When I wondered about my body, I was back at the Honda, observing as they carefully extracted David Richardson from the wreckage and loaded him onto a gurney. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, checking his pulse, inserting an IV, calling out numbers I didn't understand. One of them, a young woman with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, kept saying, "Stay with us, sir." "Can you hear me?" But David Richardson's eyes stayed closed, and his breathing grew more and more irregular. I found myself studying his face, my face, with detached interest. He looked older than I felt, more worn down. There were lines around his eyes I hadn't noticed before, a tightness in his jaw that spoke of years of clenched teeth and swallowed words. Even unconscious, he looked like he was trying to solve a problem he couldn't quite grasp. The ambulance ride to the hospital passed in what felt like both an instant and an eternity. I stayed with my body, floating near the ceiling of the ambulance, watching the paramedics work. They'd gotten his breathing stabilized, but his heart rate kept dropping. The machines beeped steadily, then irregularly, then not at all for long stretches that made the paramedics exchange worried looks. "We're losing him," the blonde woman said to her partner, a middle-aged man with gentle hands and tired eyes. They shocked David Richardson's chest twice before his heart found its rhythm again. As we pulled up to the emergency room at Grady Hospital, I felt something shifting around me. The air, if it was air, began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor seemed softer, warmer. The sounds grew muffled, as if I were listening to everything through water. I followed as they wheeled my body into Trauma Bay 3, watched as a team of doctors and nurses surrounded the gurney with practiced urgency. Someone was cutting away my clothes, checking for injuries, barking orders about blood pressure and CAT scans. Dr. Martinez, according to his name tag, was pressing his stethoscope against David Richardson's chest, frowning at whatever he heard there. "Significant internal bleeding," he said to the nurse, making notes on a clipboard. "We need to get him up to surgery now." But even as they prepared to move my body to the operating room, I felt myself being gently pulled away from the scene. Not against my will. Nothing about this experience felt forced or frightening. It was more like being invited to step through a doorway I hadn't noticed before. The hospital walls began to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone entirely. The sounds of the trauma team grew distant, though I could still sense their frantic efforts to save David Richardson's life. I found myself in a space that wasn't quite a place, surrounded by something that wasn't quite light, but was somehow more illuminating than any light I'd ever known. And for the first time since childhood, maybe for the first time ever, I felt completely, utterly at peace. The space I entered wasn't really a place in any sense I could understand. It was more like stepping into the center of something alive, not a room or landscape, but pure consciousness itself. The light wasn't coming from any direction. It was everywhere, through everything, part of everything. When I tried to look at it directly, I realized I wasn't seeing it with my eyes. I was experiencing it with some deeper part of myself that had no name. And then, without any fanfare or dramatic announcement, I became aware that I wasn't alone. There was someone with me in this ocean of light, not someone I could see in the conventional sense. There was no body, no face, no physical form. But their presence was more real, more solid, than anything I'd ever encountered in my physical life. It was like suddenly realizing you'd been holding your breath for 47 years and could finally exhale. What struck me immediately was how familiar this presence felt. Not familiar like recognizing an old friend, but familiar like remembering something I'd somehow always known but had forgotten. Like coming home to a house I'd never been to before, but where every room was exactly where I expected it to be. "David," the presence said, though there were no words, no sound in the air. The communication came from everywhere and nowhere, bypassing my ears entirely and arriving directly in the core of my being. It was my name, but spoken in a way that contained everything I had ever been, ever done, ever hoped to become. In that single word, I heard every birthday, every disappointment, every small victory, every quiet moment of fear in the dark. And then, without warning, my entire life began to unfold around us. Not like a movie playing on a screen, but like stepping back into each moment and experiencing it from the inside. I was 5 years old again, sitting on my father's lap while he read the newspaper, feeling the scratch of his whiskers against my cheek and the safety of his arms around me. I felt his love in that moment, not the complicated, conditional love I'd interpreted as a child, but the pure, desperate, overwhelming love he'd never known how to express. I was 12, striking out in Little League while my mother watched from the bleachers. This time, instead of feeling the familiar shame and disappointment, I felt her heart breaking for me, felt her wanting to run onto the field and hold me, felt her pride in how I picked up my bat and walked back to the dugout with my head up. I was 23, asking Mary to marry me in that terrible restaurant with the sticky floors and fluorescent lighting. I'd always remembered my nervousness, my fear that she'd say no. Now I felt her joy, her certainty, her relief that I'd finally asked. I felt how beautiful she thought I looked in that moment, how much she loved my nervous laugh, how she'd already started planning our wedding before I'd finished the question. Each scene came with this double awareness, my own experience and everyone else's, woven together into something complete. I saw myself through Mary's eyes on our wedding day, nervous and young and trying so hard to be worthy of her. I felt her patience during the years when work consumed me, felt how she'd lie awake at night wondering if I still loved her, felt her hope every time she asked about my day, hoping this would be the time I'd really talk to her. I experienced Katie's childhood from her perspective, how enormous I'd seemed to her at 3 years old, how safe my voice made her feel when I read bedtime stories, how she'd practice her dance recital routines in the living room, performing specifically for me, waiting for my approval. I felt her confusion as I'd gradually withdrawn, felt her child's logic blaming herself, wondering what she'd done to make Daddy stop really seeing her. But what surprised me most was that none of these revelations came with judgment. There was no cosmic scorekeeper tallying my failures, no stern voice listing my shortcomings. Instead, there was this overwhelming sense of understanding, of context, of seeing the whole picture instead of just the broken fragments I'd been carrying. "Do you see now?" the presence asked. And somehow I did see. I saw that every interaction was a chance for connection, every conversation an opportunity for love. I saw that the withdrawn, careful man I'd become wasn't the real me. He was just the armor I'd built to protect something precious that I'd forgotten I was carrying. "You have never failed," the voice continued, and I felt the truth of it settle into me like warm water. "You have only forgotten who you are." And in that moment, I remembered. Not with my mind, but with every cell, every particle of whatever I was now. I remembered being infinite, being connected to everything, being made of the same substance as the stars and the space between them. I remembered that love wasn't something I had to earn or deserve. It was what I was made of, what everything was made of. I understood suddenly why I'd spent so many years feeling empty. It wasn't because I was broken or inadequate. It was because I'd been trying to fill an infinite space with finite things: approval, success, control, safety. I'd been trying to solve homesickness with everything except going home. "But I hurt them," I said, thinking of Mary's tears in the kitchen, of Katie's eager face when I'd been too distracted to really listen. "I was so selfish, so closed off." "You were afraid," the presence replied, and I felt such gentleness in those words. Fear makes us forget, but forgetting is not the same as being lost. You were never lost, David. You were always exactly where you needed to be, learning exactly what you needed to learn. I felt myself crying then, though I had no body to produce tears. It was a crying that came from somewhere deeper than my chest, a release of all the guilt and shame and self-judgment I'd been carrying. All those years of feeling like a fraud, like an inadequate husband and father, like someone pretending to be good enough, all of it dissolved in this ocean of unconditional love. "Will you go back?" the presence asked. And somehow I knew what this meant. I could stay here in this perfect understanding, this complete connection, or I could return to that broken body in the hospital, to the mess and complications of human life, to Mary and Katie and all the opportunities for love I'd missed the first time around. For a moment, I hesitated. Why would anyone choose confusion over clarity, separation over unity, fear over love? And then I felt them. Mary, waiting in some hospital corridor, probably reading a magazine and trying not to cry. Katie, flying home from college, staring out an airplane window and praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. I felt their love for me, complicated and imperfect and utterly real. I felt all the conversations we'd never had, all the moments of connection still waiting to unfold. "Yes," I heard myself say, "I'll go back." The presence smiled, not with a face, but with everything around us. The light grew brighter, more welcoming, more alive. "Then remember," was the last thing I heard as the infinite space began to fade. "Remember who you are." In that space beyond words, something fundamental shifted in my understanding. It wasn't like suddenly knowing the answer to a difficult question. It was more like remembering something I'd always known, but had spent a lifetime trying to forget. The presence with me didn't offer explanations or theology. Instead, I found myself living through every moment of my 47 years, but experiencing them from a perspective I'd never imagined possible. I was 5 years old again, sitting at the kitchen table while my father ate his eggs in silence. But this time, I didn't just feel my own confusion and desperate need for his attention. I felt his exhaustion, his worry about the bills stacked on the counter, his fear that he was failing as a provider. I felt his love for me, a love so vast and wordless that it made his throat close up every time he tried to express it. I felt how my small voice asking about his day was the brightest part of his morning, even when he could only manage a grunt in response. Every scene unfolded like this. I was simultaneously myself and everyone else, understanding for the first time that every interaction was a collision of inner worlds I'd never bothered to imagine. When Mary had stood in our kitchen asking if I loved her, I felt her terror. Not just of losing me, but of discovering she'd wasted 20 years loving someone who was incapable of loving her back. I felt how my emotional withdrawal had made her question her own worth, how she'd stared at herself in the bathroom mirror wondering what was wrong with her that she couldn't reach her own husband. I experienced Katie's childhood from her perspective, how my distracted responses when she tried to tell me about school made her feel invisible. I felt her practicing conversations with me in her head, trying to find some topic that would make me really look at her. I lived through her adolescence when she'd given up trying to connect with me, and I felt her sadness at having a father who was physically present but emotionally absent. But what struck me most wasn't the pain I'd caused. It was the love that had surrounded me the entire time. Even in the moments when I'd felt most alone, most inadequate, most like a failure, there had been this constant current of love flowing through everything. Mary's love, even when I'd hurt her. Katie's love, even when I'd disappointed her. My father's love, even when he couldn't find words for it. More than that, there was something larger, a love that existed in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between words, in the silence I'd always found so frightening. It wasn't conditional on my performance or dependent on my worth. It simply was, like gravity or breath, the fundamental force that held everything together. "Do you see?" the presence asked, and I understood that this wasn't a question about my vision or comprehension. It was about recognition. Did I see that the hell I'd been living wasn't punishment from some external judge, but the natural result of cutting myself off from the love that was always available? I saw it clearly now. Every time I'd chosen self-protection over vulnerability, every time I'd chosen control over connection, every time I'd chosen the safety of emotional distance over the risk of being truly known, I'd been building walls between myself and the very thing I was desperately hungry for. I'd been dying of thirst while standing in a river. The only prison, the presence continued, is the one you build in your own mind. The only hell is the hell of separation from love, and the only key to freedom is forgiveness, not just receiving it, but giving it. In that moment, I understood what forgiveness actually meant. It wasn't about excusing behavior or pretending hurt didn't matter. It was about releasing the stranglehold I'd kept on old wounds, about choosing connection over the bitter satisfaction of being right. It was about recognizing that holding on to resentment was like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. I found myself reaching out, not with hands, but with something deeper, toward every person I'd held at arm's length. My father, who'd done his best with the emotional tools he'd been given. Mary, who'd loved me faithfully even when I'd made it almost impossible. Katie, who'd never stopped hoping I'd become the father she needed. Even myself, that scared, performing little boy who'd been running from his own shadow for 47 years. As I extended this forgiveness, something extraordinary happened. The scenes from my life didn't disappear. They were transformed. The kitchen where my father and I had sat in awkward silence became filled with the unspoken love that had always been there. The moments when I'd failed Mary or disappointed Katie became stepping stones of understanding rather than sources of shame. Every mistake, every moment of smallness or fear was revealed as part of a larger pattern of learning, growing, becoming human. "This is what you came to remember," the presence said, and I felt the truth of it settle into every part of me. Not that you're perfect, but that you're loved. Not that you don't make mistakes, but that mistakes don't define you. Not that life is easy, but that it's meaningful. I understood then why I had to go back, not because I was being punished or tested, but because there were still conversations to be had, still moments of connection waiting to unfold. Mary was sitting in a hospital waiting room, probably reading a magazine and trying not to think about becoming a widow. Katie was on a plane somewhere, staring out the window and promising a God she wasn't sure existed that she'd be a better daughter if I just pulled through. They needed to know what I'd learned, not through my words, which had always failed me, but through my presence. They needed to experience the man I could be when I wasn't constantly defending against the fear of not being enough. They needed to feel the love that had always been there, waiting beneath my protective layers of distance and control. "When you forget again," the presence said gently, and I understood this wasn't an if, but a when. Remember that forgetting doesn't erase truth. The love doesn't disappear when you can't feel it. The connection doesn't break when you feel alone. Come back to this moment. Come back to what you know now. I felt myself being drawn back toward that hospital room, toward the machines and the medical smells and the complicated business of being human. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I was carrying something now, not knowledge exactly, but remembrance. A cellular understanding that beneath all the noise and confusion and daily struggles of life, there was this unshakable foundation of love. As the infinite space began to fade, the last thing I heard wasn't words, but a feeling. Go love them the way you've been loved. Go forgive them the way you've been forgiven. Go be the light you've always been, even when you couldn't see it yourself. And then I was falling back into time, back into my body, back into the beautiful, difficult work of being David Richardson. But this time, with the memory of who I really was, shining like a candle in the darkness of forgetting. Go back. There's still love left to give. Those words came not as a command, but as an invitation, like someone reminding you that you'd left your car keys on the table. The infinite space around me began to fade, not all at once, but gradually, like walking from a brightly lit room into twilight. I felt myself being drawn back through layers of consciousness, each one more dense, more limited than the last, until finally I slammed back into my body with the jarring shock of jumping into cold water. The first sensation was pain. Everything hurt. My chest, my head, even my fingertips. After the weightless perfection of that other place, being trapped in a physical form felt like being stuffed into a box 3 sizes too small. The second sensation was sound, the steady beeping of monitors, the hushed voices of medical staff, the wheeze and click of machines helping me breathe. "He's back," someone said, and I heard the relief in their voice even through my confusion. I tried to open my eyes, but the fluorescent lights were too harsh, too sharp after the warm golden glow I'd been swimming in. Everything in this world seemed jagged and loud and unnecessarily complicated. "David, can you hear me?" A woman's voice, professional but kind. I managed to crack my eyes open and saw a doctor leaning over me, checking my pupils with a small flashlight. Behind her, a nurse was writing something on a chart. "You've been unconscious for 6 hours. You're in Grady Hospital. Do you remember what happened?" I remembered everything, the rain, the truck, the moment of impact. But more than that, I remembered where I'd been for those 6 hours. I remembered the presence, the love, the understanding that had washed away 47 years of accumulated guilt and self-judgment. I remembered feeling completely known, completely accepted, completely home. But as I tried to hold on to those memories, I felt them already beginning to fade around the edges, like trying to cup water in my hands. The more I grasped for the experience, the more it seemed to slip away, leaving me with just the echo of what I'd felt, the shadow of what I'd learned. "Mary," I whispered, my throat raw from the intubation. "Katie?" "Your wife is in the waiting room," the doctor said gently. "We'll bring her in shortly. Your daughter is flying in from college. You're very lucky, Mr. Richardson. By all rights, you shouldn't have survived that accident." But as Mary came through the door 20 minutes later, her eyes red from crying and her hair disheveled from hours of pacing hospital corridors, I realized I hadn't survived the accident. The man who'd driven into that intersection in the rain, David Richardson, 47, regional sales director, functional alcoholic, emotional refugee, he had died in that wreckage. The person looking at Mary now was someone else entirely, someone who remembered what it felt like to be made of light. "Oh God, David," she whispered, taking my hand carefully, afraid of disturbing the IV line. "I thought I'd lost you." "You did," I said, and saw her face crumple with confusion and fear. "But I came back." The next few weeks were harder than I'd expected. Everyone kept telling me how lucky I was, how miraculous my recovery had been. The truck driver visited me in the hospital, crying and apologizing, and I found myself hugging him, telling him it wasn't his fault, feeling genuine compassion for his pain. The nurses whispered about it afterwards. They'd never seen an accident victim comfort the person who'd hit him. But alongside the physical healing came a deeper struggle. The world I'd returned to seemed simultaneously too bright and too dim, too loud and too quiet. Colors looked different. Food tasted different. Conversations I'd once found important, about work, about money, about who was winning the latest political argument, sounded like children arguing over toys. Most difficult of all was the gradual fading of the experience itself. Each day, the memories became a little less vivid, a little more like something I might have dreamed. I found myself wondering if the medications had caused hallucinations, if my oxygen-deprived brain had simply created a comforting fantasy to ease the transition toward death. But then Mary would say something sharp out of habit, and instead of withdrawing into familiar hurt, I'd find myself seeing her pain, her fear, her desperate need to be loved. Katie would call from college with some minor crisis, and instead of feeling burdened by her needs, I'd hear the little girl in her voice asking if Daddy thought she was worth his attention. 3 months after the accident, Mary and I were having coffee in the kitchen on a Saturday morning when she said, "You're different. I can't put my finger on how, but you're not the same person who left for Birmingham that day." I looked at her across the table. This woman who'd loved me faithfully for 23 years, who'd waited patiently for me to become the husband she deserved, who'd built a life around my emotional unavailability and called it marriage. In her eyes, I could see the question she was afraid to ask. Would this version of me stay, or would he gradually disappear back into the old David's protective shell? "I love you," I said, and meant it in a way I'd never meant anything before. Not the obligatory "love you too" I'd offered for decades, but a recognition of the light I could see shining through her, even when she couldn't see it herself. "I'm sorry I forgot that for so long." She started crying then. Not the frustrated tears of our last real conversation before the accident, but tears of relief, of recognition, of hope that maybe it wasn't too late for us after all. I never went back to my old job. Sitting in meetings, talking about market penetration and quarterly projections felt like speaking a foreign language I'd somehow forgotten. Instead, I started volunteering at a hospice center, sitting with people who were dying, holding their hands, listening to their stories. My supervisor there, a nurse named Angela who'd been working with the dying for 15 years, told me I had a gift for making people feel less afraid. "What do you tell them?" she asked me one afternoon, as we watched an elderly man breathe more easily after I'd spent an hour with him. "I tell them they're going home," I said, "and that home is more beautiful than they remember. People ask me sometimes if I really went to heaven, if I actually met God, if what I experienced was real or just the brain's last desperate attempt to make sense of dying. I tell them it doesn't matter what they call it. What matters is that for 6 hours I remembered who I really was underneath all the fear and performance and self-protection. I remembered that I was made of the same substance as love itself, and that forgetting doesn't make it less true. I still forget sometimes. I still catch myself withdrawing when I'm scared, still hear that old voice telling me I'm not good enough, still struggle with the gap between what I know and what I feel on any given Tuesday. But now I have something to come back to, not just a memory of that experience, but a practice of remembering. Every morning before the day's noise begins, I sit quietly and try to recall not the details of what I saw in that space beyond space, but the feeling of being completely known and completely loved. I try to carry that feeling with me into my interactions with Mary, with Katie, with the strangers I meet in grocery stores and gas stations and hospital waiting rooms. Sometimes when I'm really present, really remembering, I can see it. That same light I encountered in my near-death experience, shining through ordinary faces in ordinary moments. The cashier at the supermarket who's worried about her mother's chemotherapy. The teenager bagging groceries who's afraid he'll never amount to anything. The businessman in line behind me who's wondering if his life has any meaning. They're all carrying the same light I discovered in myself, even if they've forgotten it's there. Especially if they've forgotten it's there. That's what I came back for, I think. Not to preach or convince or convert, but simply to remember, and in remembering, to help others remember too. Heaven isn't a place we go when we die. It's what we are when we stop forgetting who we really are. The accident was 5 years ago now. Mary and I renewed our vows on our 25th wedding anniversary, and this time when I promised to love her until death do us part, I understood that death never parts anything real. Katie graduated law school last spring, and when she hugged me at the ceremony, she whispered, "I'm proud to be your daughter." I cried like a baby. I don't know if I'll have another dramatic spiritual experience before I die for real. I hope I won't need one. I'm learning that the miraculous is hidden in the mundane, that grace is available in every conversation, that love is the most ordinary and extraordinary thing in the universe. Every sunrise feels like a promise I once heard in the light. Every breath is a reminder that I chose to come back. Every moment is another chance to remember what I've never actually forgotten, that we're all just walking each other home.